delighted to be doing our first videotaping of one of our, do you know whether this is our, we don't know what number of our,
Synergos it is?
Synergos it is?
We've been doing it for
8
6 years now.
6 years now. But delighted to have Dr. Richard Dasher from Stanford, from the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center here with us. Dr. Dasher has a PhD in linguistics, and he is fluent in Japanese. And Dr. Dasher, if you could tell us a little bit more about the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center and what it is about cloud computing that made you take an interest and a focus in that area this year.
Okay. Well, the short answer is that's where the money is. The long answer is that we are a research center in the School of Engineering at Stanford, and one of our main missions is to bring information about new emerging trends, especially outside the United States, especially in Asia, to the Silicon Valley, and make sure that the research community here and also the business community here understands the connections between business and technology in these areas. So cloud computing started to show up on our radar screen a number of years ago. And we've really just finished the third year of a major project on new business opportunities related to cloud computing that we're doing for this year, a Japanese client company, major corporation from Japan. Now, we actually started with this as a sponsored project by a Brazilian business software company. So we're not just interested in Asia. This Brazilian software company has 55% of the Latin American market, and nobody knows their name up here. So we're trying very hard to kind of make good connections and build bridges. So with cloud computing, we're really looking at what I would say is the third major wave. I know this sounds like Alvin Toffler. The third wave of the information technology revolution. The first wave was when everybody started to have a PC on their desk. Second wave was when all these PCs were connected to the internet. Now, what has happened is have realized a much more efficient architecture for storing and processing information. For instance, if you're a company and you've got 100 computers, they're all running Windows. What would happen if you could basically have one machine running Windows inside a data center, and then all you do is you share the applications and you share the data as the computers need to do? Well, this is the term that's called virtualization. And so sure enough, what happens is that to make the use of the servers more efficient, now the data centers are virtualizing machines. You have virtual machines that run in the data center, which basically means you have no idea where your data is actually being processed. To make matters worse, the data center may not be inside the company. In fact, these days it probably is not inside the company. I think Facebook's biggest data center is in Finland now. And so you have information that belongs to somebody that is distributed all over the world, and this is where we really came in, right? So this is where you need to look at the issues that surround cloud computing, both from a business and a technology standpoint, and a little bit from the government regulation standpoint, in regard to different countries.
Well, where did the Brazilian company fit in this ecosystem that you just described?
They have business software that companies use in Brazil to manage their finances, to manage their personnel. They basically compete against Oracle and people like that down in Brazil. So they were very interested in how the cloud computing architecture might enable them to be more global.
I see.
And it really does make things easier on the one hand, but it also raises new issues with competition. You can't hide from anybody. If I introduce something here, everybody all over the world knows it, as soon as the file can be downloaded from the internet. And so it really has changed the way that business has to be done. The impact of cloud computing is really only beginning to be felt. This past year, so this is Gartner has said that in 2011, 7% of all of the data in the world is in the cloud. But they're predicting that by 2016, 36% of all of the data will be in the cloud. Anybody who's ever used Gmail or Yahoo Mail or shared pictures on Instagram or Dropbox, all of this is cloud. Now, more broadly, cloud computing really enables people to do things with their smartphones that would have been impossible without a cloud computing architecture. So all of the mobile space is really dependent on the cloud. You have new things that are coming up with sensor networks, intelligent transportation systems. So just this week, the University of Michigan has announced that they got government money to network 2,800 automobiles. That the automobiles will self-create new networks as they're driving along, and this will be more safe because the automobiles can tell each other when they need to stop. Okay. But as another kind of thing, okay, where does that take you? Also, just this week is a new service that says that they can predict where you are going to be. Now, we've already seen location-based services like Foursquare, where you check in and say when you're at a location. This new service looks at GPS data from your smartphone, who you've been calling on your smartphone, right? Because that's all records they can get from the phone company. It looks at your Facebook friend pattern. It looks at your employment data that's also public from places like LinkedIn. And they can predict where you are going if you are moving somewhere.
Well, Richard, let's talk a little bit about this notion of being able to find anybody anywhere, and the pros and cons of that. Do you see any differences, since a lot of the work you do is with organizations, governments, universities in Asia? How do, for example, Asian populations, companies, universities, and cultures feel about that kind of, shall we say, invasion of privacy vis-a-vis the way American populations and Western populations are adapting to this?
How many hours do we have? Really, this is one of the biggest issues with the cloud, is that countries can't even come up with their own policies in a timely way. And so trying to harmonize policies across countries is a real mess. Forget the Asians for a minute. The Europeans have completely different privacy standards than we do in the United States. And the Europeans were working on a law that was passed in 1995, remember way back then? And so when Google came out with its Street View in Europe, they were accidentally making public personal information without the prior written consent of the people whose information was going out. Well, even inside Europe, some countries in Europe said you must delete this information immediately. Other countries said you must hold on to this information indefinitely. So that's the issue. You have that. The Europeans are actually doing a new law this year, and their law will come into effect in 2016. The Americans say they're doing a new law this year, but it's kind of not really going anywhere because America has always had a more laissez-faire approach to letting the companies self-regulate themselves. So that's one issue. And then you run into something like China, where it's actually hard to tell the difference between government control over information to know where the population is, and classic old protectionist ways of keeping foreign companies out. China has a personal information protection law that's been on the books since 2003. The problem with this law is that it's been enforced in several different contradictory ways since 2003. So nobody knows what to do with it. But the strong version of how this law is enforced is that a company may not share personal information about one of its customers, even with another division of the company, without getting prior consent. Which means that any foreign company in China cannot share customer data with its parent company outside China. So it's, a situation where the real problem there is consistency of enforcement. But the whole privacy is one of the main areas where you see different kind of standards and different kind of regulatory frameworks that have been a barrier to business. I should also, my quote for the day is from Steve Wozniak. A couple of weeks ago, he was quoted about cloud computing, and he said, "It's going to be horrible. I think there are going to be a lot of horrible problems in the next 5 years." Now notice, this is in the context of Apple launching iCloud. So clearly he says what he wants to say. And these problems are happening, and hopefully by the end of the evening, we can also talk a little bit about how we can respond and what we need to do in the middle of all this.
Well, there must be hundreds of companies, and I'm wanting to say thousands of companies as we speak, maybe right here in Silicon Valley, that are building businesses hoping to make lots of money based on big data and mining data. So how do you
Well, that's certainly true. And without big data, you really are kind of nothing these days, right? That's been I was looking back through some work that we did 7 years ago, and we were talking about medical imaging. And just in medical imaging, when you think about how many more bits there are in the world now, just because of the improvements in how the images are made and shared, it's astounding. But big data assumes that somebody owns it, right? So part of the problem with data is that if you don't know where it is, how do you assert your ownership rights? And this is one where there's an international aspect to this as well. In the United States, the government, if they see a internet service doing something wrong, can seize all of the physical assets, including the servers, including all the tape storage disks, including all of the backup disks. And this happened just yesterday, in fact. The government shut down 3 domain names that they said were running counterfeit Android applications. So all of the people who were using these storage sites, who are not running counterfeit data applications, now have to sue the company in order to get access to their own data. And of course, there's nothing about this on the Department of Justice website. They're just saying how much they're, preventing counterfeiting and how important this is and so forth. But in point of fact, ownership of data means that you must be able to access your data, you must be able to use it, it must be something that you don't share without giving permission to, and you should be able to port it from one service to the next. In fact, that's part of the Europeans' law, is that data must be portable. As it isn't really in the US. If you read the fine print on the Google contract, whenever you use like Google Drive, which is a cloud-based storage service, you keep the ownership to your data. That prevents them from being accused of owning counterfeit pictures, right?
Mm.
That saves their rear end.
Right.
But you give them an unrestricted license to do all these things with the data. And it's like 5 lines of, narrow prose about we can publish it, we can redo it, we can analyze it, we can do anything to your data. And then you go a few lines down and it says, these rights persist even after you remove your original data from our system.
Oh.
How is that possible?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're Google, that's what you do, right? This is an area, data ownership, you can find all kinds of stuff out on the internet in terms of special focus groups and people who are really worried about this. And we're still worried about the United States. Is my data here or is it in Oregon? If I'm going to sue somebody, do I get to sue them in Silicon Valley or do I have to sue them in Oregon? Especially because it's not just the contract between me and the data center provider, it's all these third people. They get sued by the Northern District Court of Seattle, and then what has to happen? Who do I have to appeal to get back my data? And all of this is money, right? This is, if you try to sue somebody in a different city, it gets really expensive really fast.
Well, certainly from an area that Ellen and I are very interested in, or the Hayden Group has been working in, is healthcare technology platforms and the value of aggregating medical information and being able to paint holistic pictures of people's health care.
Yeah.
I mean, right now, unfortunately, it is the mother often in a family situation that has to do triage among the various healthcare givers in order to paint a holistic picture of their child or an older person's information. Right. So there are indeed a lot of benefits to aggregating data, and also to being not only just for being able to get a single picture of the patient's information, but to share data and to be able to learn more about the healthcare of populations and so forth. So it's not all bad.
No, it's not. I think that's a really good example of how something that would really has been impossible up to now is becoming possible through the cloud. So yeah, my records are all with Stanford Hospital now, and if something happens, they know who I am. And even if something happens to me in upstate Michigan, they know who I am because they can contact. And this is part of it. The other part of it, think of the energy savings that have happened by moving to data centers where you're not running 5,000 copies of Windows operating system. You've got, one user interface and then just the applications running. That actually is a very green technology. I think that the business that's enabled by the cloud is compelling. This is not something that is going to blow away. There's all these problems, but we're in a classic case of where the legal frameworks and to a certain extent even the business models just haven't kept up with the new opportunities which are appearing so quickly. So I really think that these problems are likely to be solved. One hopes that we won't get into deeper water than we're in already in terms of how the problems are solved.
Are you finding with the Asian populations and so forth, aside from the Chinese, that the government control issues are more difficult in other areas like Japan and so forth?
Japan's problem is not really government control. The real issue there is that they pay too much attention to customer focus. And so the current sales divisions of the major companies are basically listen to what the customers already know that they want. And unlike the old days when Sony introduced the Walkman and there really was nothing like it out in the market. The last few things that have been introduced have not been introduced in Japan, right? And so I think that of all the countries in the world, Japan actually came out as #1 in having the very best infrastructure for cloud computing, including intellectual property protection and regulatory regime and standards and so forth. And yet Japan is far behind where we are in regard to implementing cloud-based business software or cloud-based approaches to, consumer applications. Part of it's the old phone system. The smartphone is really recent in Japan. The Japanese companies had non-interchangeable, they were not interoperable. Feature phones is what they were called. So if I had a telephone subscription with one phone company, I couldn't send an email to anybody at one of the other phone companies. And this persisted really until the iPhone hit town, which was about 2008. And the iPhone has taken off in Japan like crazy. And of course that just makes the Japanese handset makers more and more depressed. And, but Japan is really poised, and I think this is one reason we're getting good research funding from a Japanese company that's looking at new opportunities out of the cloud. The other problem with Japan, speaking very frankly, is that it has not really adopted the kind of open innovation framework that we have here. The big companies here are always looking at new ideas outside their company, and they will buy them. So they will spend everything from a few dozen $1 million to over $1 billion to buy something that they think is in their critical path. VMware, which makes the virtualization software that's really at the key to this new kind of data structure, spent $1.25 billion buying a company called Nicira Networks in January. And interestingly enough, both companies came from the same professor's lab at Stanford. So he's not doing too badly. Unfortunately, it wasn't my lab. Anyway, I think that it's an interesting problem where the business side of cloud computing is also hard to understand, and the Japanese haven't got that. And things like freemium business models don't work unless you really have some sort of a cloud framework, right? We'll let you use it for a while, but then you got to pay for it after X amount of use or whatever. It works fine if you don't have to redo a download or anything like that. So, cloud computing is made for that. But until you really get used to a totally different kind of cash flow and a totally different sort of customer relationship, it's very hard to make this new kind of framework.
You were telling me something that when we were talking about doing this talk that interested me. You were talking about the proliferation of sensors.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about that in Japan.
Well, okay, that is an area where Japan has been way ahead of us. They probably have more sensors per kilometer of road in Japan than anywhere else in the world. And they've used this to give you absolutely wonderful information about rush hour traffic, which is usually very depressing. But they have a lot of sensing technology in Japan. And that's one of the reasons they're very strong in robotics. Robots have more motion sensors and attitude sensors than you can imagine. And so this is an area in which they've traditionally been strong. And, the software control of the robot is also an area that lends itself to remote operation. So I think that we'll see wave after wave of new kinds of data. Up to now, most of the data in the cloud has been basically text, letters and numbers, right? But now we're starting to get behavior analysis of videos. or audio input, audio interface between a person and the system. And that's the next wave, and I think internet television is going to be a big part of that.
Oh, absolutely.
That's going to really change the whole kind of value chain of the entertainment industry, just like the iTunes changed the way that music is distributed. So video image data is kind of the next big wave. Kind of right out there beyond that is sensor data. And part of that has to do with finding the right kind of business models for it. There's been lots of talk about, automated supply chains in which you know where every box is, not just every pallet, but every box. You know exactly where it is, and so you can automate the whole process of distribution even better than it is. That kind of thing will require really cheap, very reliable radio frequency identification.
I know Cisco is really interested in the Internet of Things. Does that fit into the whole Internet of Things
That
paradigm?
is the Internet of Things. So Internet of Things is where you don't need human interface. The name I prefer is machine-to-machine processing or interaction, where essentially the human only gets involved when there's a decision to be made by a human. And so Internet of Things is a real popular term in China. The premier of China picked up on this about 5 years ago, and they're doing a lot of research into it. I was actually allowed to visit the Internet of Things Research Center in Wuxi, and it was a very interesting experience because, like in the US, a lot of the applications are military. So I could see boxes that would just, look like a box on the table, that this is our, node for this network, and I couldn't ask anything about the system board or the chips in it. So, yeah, the military applications are there, and this is, kind of gets into the role of government. What is the kind of appropriate level of government intervention? This network I mentioned up in Michigan. So if these cars are talking to each other, are they also talking to the NSA? How much do they know about who's where and what car they're in and what they're doing? Of course there's safety, but there's also the privacy. Right? And our approach is to wait until a problem happens and then fight it out in the courts.
Our approach, meaning Americans' approach?
Yeah,
or?
especially. The Europeans will try to regulate it before it happens. And it may work and it may not. I mean, neither one is intrinsically better than the other. The problem with that approach in some place like India is that you have about a 10-year waiting period to get to court. There are more than 60 million law cases that have not yet made it to court in India. So generally, businesses solve that problem with simple things by paying off the other side.
Well, I don't see in the current political environment America getting more regulated. Unless you disagree with that.
It's actually a very interesting question.
Yeah.
I think that the question will be how the regulations are written. If they're relatively transparent and understandable and can be enforced relatively consistently, we will not feel like there's an increase in regulation. However, if they write them like a lot of laws get written and it winds up being a real mess, we'll probably be unhappy. Although I think the big business in the US is very involved in this issue, and they're very concerned about protecting their own situation. It's no accident that Twitter hired one of Obama's aides to be their vice president of government relations. So, the companies in the US will probably do all right. And if you get way out of line, people will just shut down. They will stop using these systems. And if they do too many weird things with the data center providers in the US, I already ran into one blog site while I was preparing for this talk that said, I would never store my data in the United States. I'll put it in Canada, I'll put it in Latin America, I'll put it in Europe, but never in the US. Wow.
And who said this?
I don't want to name names. It was
Oh.
somebody who was, commenting about this whole issue of access to data and the fact that the government has the right to seize your
see.
data. And so, if that makes a few ugly things, then the congressman of whatever district that happens in is going to have some real interesting discussions on the floor very soon. You're making us lose jobs.
Well, I just, if you look at TechCrunch, for example,
Yeah.
and you look at companies that are being funded, it seems like almost every company being funded has, as a kind of a subtext or a dimension of their business plan, data mining.
Yeah,
I mean, it may not be the primary component, but data mining is a part of it. It's part of the way that they're going to make money. It's a
well, we
component.
created all this data, so now people are gonna start to find the value in data,
That's right.
right? And in a way, it has to happen, but, I do wonder how long people will cooperate. Someone said that data is the currency of the new business. And so if I'm providing on a barter basis all my data in return for access to some service like Google Maps, at what point do I decide that's too much weighted in Google's favor and I'm gonna not play ball? I would like to be compensated a little bit for this. And I do think that some things we're going to see all kinds of really interesting, it's going to be a really interesting 5 years. Inside the company, customer relationship management software, CRM software.
Sure.
So traditionally, a client would be the property of one of the salespeople. Am I going to put the data about my client out there where every other salesperson can see that and do a better job than I do at getting commissions next month?
Well, I think I may have mentioned to you that, there was a, article, I believe it was in Forbes, about, how LinkedIn, anybody who puts a profile on LinkedIn is literally giving up free information for recruiters, to be able to,
Sure. To the extent that I've heard, kind of from you, I think, that a lot of companies don't really want their executives to be on LinkedIn because it kind of makes them too obvious targets.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So data, I think data as a business currency is huge.
Yeah.
I also just wonder if this is one of these, genies out of a bottle that's going to be difficult, if not impossible, to put back in. I mean, certainly, I'm just wondering if some of us have gotten used to the, convenience of
Yeah.
dealing with data in the cloud such that we're willing to, in a certain sort of living within, in a goldfish bowl, that we're willing to accept to deal with a certain, exposure, if you will, and risk.
I'm basically positive. I mean, I've been saying a lot of kind of, stuff tonight, but I'm basically positive that we've got so many good things now. This really is the third wave. The first was the PCs, second was the network PCs, third is all the things that we can do. Information technology is so transparent, we use it without thinking about it, and this new kind of architecture is a big part of that. What was the world like before Facebook? How many hours a day do people spend communicating with friends that they never did before? And that's basically a people-to-people relationship, right? In this regard, IT has really led to closer people relationships in many ways. I can keep in touch with people I grew up with that I'd never heard from for years, right? And so I'm basically positive. I think that the interesting things will happen as people get a little bit out of balance one way or another. And it will be very interesting to see the solutions that people come up with. How will people monetize their data to the companies? We'll see that from companies offering incentives to people to play ball. We'll see discounts. We'll see, special coupons. Already seeing it. And, I think that if there's one thing that can really mess the whole thing up, and this really is sort of my worst case scenario, and I share this with, I think, the head of Homeland Security, is when we have the internet equivalent of 9/11.
Right.
Because all of this works because we have instant, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, completely reliable access to our information wherever it is. We can do things no matter where the server is, no matter where our photographs are. And I do think that if that is broken, if you cannot rely on access to your own information, or your company can't rely on access to its information, things will be really ugly for a while. So I would invest in local backup. I'm very serious. You can put all your photographs on Instagram, but I sure would save a CD. And just that impresses me as one area in which you don't want to be alarmist, but you just think, okay, be prudent, be practical. And so I would make sure that I save, every time I buy or sell a stock, always print out the confirmation of the transaction, right?
One of the things that you mentioned when you and I were talking about doing this talk is the Great Firewall of China. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the Great Firewall of China is basically a filter. And it is, Laura, you may know more about this than I do, but there's a lot of people whose job it is to watch the internet and all the traffic coming across the internet for new words that you will block. So a lot of the words that are blocked are words that probably wouldn't be a bad idea to block here too, things related to porn and that kind of stuff. But there's also things like blocking references to the Falun Gong, or blocking references to certain islands off the coast of Japan when there was a problem with a Chinese fishing ship being caught. So, it's a very labor-intensive activity, and there's an awful lot of people who are involved in it. There's also an aspect of it that I think is just plain and simple protectionism. Every smartphone in China is sold with a Facebook icon and a Twitter icon. And Facebook and Twitter are not accessible in China. So everybody's got the icons on their phone, but you just touch it and nothing happens, right? Instead, there are domestic services. The domestic service for Twitter is Weibo. And it's a very, very similar to Twitter. I really think that if they were really worried about strange information getting out because of Twitter, Weibo's not a whole lot better for the government side. So a lot of it kind of looks like protectionism, which is, okay, not unusual in economic development, right? We saw protectionism in Japan in the 1960s and 70s as they built up their domestic industries, including their car industry. We've seen protectionism all over the place. The players who are already there want to keep the other people out. And I hope that we will see better international business from some Chinese companies as well as foreign companies in China, because I think that doing business on an international scale means it becomes impossible to sustain that kind of 20th century business model, right, or national policy model. The Japanese auto companies in the States had to open up the Japanese market, US market, if they didn't. And so now we have Huawei Technologies, which is really giving a run to Cisco systems. In the network equipment space, they're also selling handsets. A lot of people are terrified because the Chinese army has a major investment in Huawei. And so there are people around who just see, you know, the devil when they see Huawei coming by. But Huawei now has a research center here in Silicon Valley that's hiring 1,200 people, including 900 PhDs. So, you know, they're a part of our economy now. I'm basically really positive, but we can save ourselves a lot of trouble if we think about these issues and if we really watch. You really do need to read those fine print on the Google contract and say no thank you or whatever. And I think that if more people are aware of the kind of issues that can happen and realize that we cannot solve a problem in the US unless we're worried about harmonizing it with other countries. Gone are the days when you can solve your problems and put your head into the sand. That is really probably the most critical thing, and one reason I'm happy to be devoting most of our research resources to this area now.
To the cloud
Yeah, and related things.
and related things.
Yeah.